Okay, not as colorful as the previous two presenters, but hopefully I'll have the same amount of information in this. Thank you, Professor Suhono, Dr. Reisel, the distinguished panelists, and it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about policy area number 1 out of 9, which is the work of Task Force 2 of T20. I'm going to make the argument that that is the most important and foundational of the policy areas because the others depend on it. The previous two presentations, I think, made clear that the infrastructure needs to be there before all the digital innovations can be placed on top of them. So it's important, as I think Mr. Vanni had just made the point, is to ensure universal service. Well, let me start with something that I believe everybody in this audience is familiar with, but it's helpful, I think, to fix ideas. Digitalization is just relentless. It's ongoing, it's unstoppable. The trend towards online working, learning, commerce, healthcare, government, it just continues to grow. Quite independent of the pandemic, but the pandemic has just surged that growth exponentially. The network has stood up to the test of the pandemic as we moved from offline to online, but the digital divide remains. There's still unconnected segments of the population. I forget the figures from the last presentation, but I believe that there were quite a number in both West Java and also recorded by Bhakti. Now, however, the consequence of digital gap is more extreme because those in-person alternatives just are not there. So I'm stating the obvious here, digital inclusion is essential. So the part of my title here and my marching orders was to look at the closing of the digital gap. And so it's good to decide what it is the digital gap. Well, there's a lot of gaps. And I just list some that have been mentioned elsewhere: the coverage gap, adoption gap, upgrade gap, and that would be the gap in moving from 4G to 5G happening right now. Digital skills gap, the usage gap. I'm going to focus on the connectivity gap and that basic need to have a connection, wireline or wireless, to the internet. Right. By and large, we call that the digital divide. And it seems that it has been sliced into 3 different segments of the population that are falling on the wrong side of that digital divide. And there's first is the unserved. That is that they have no broadband available at their home or work. We're going to see in a second that that may happen for fixed, but not often for wireless. But if the smartphone is not smart enough and the data plan is not big enough, not a close substitute. There's also the underserved group, which has access to broadband, but it's of insufficient quality to meet the needs of the individual. Then there's the non-adopters, where they have service available, but they don't purchase. And the usual reasons for not purchasing are it's not useful enough, but often as well it's too costly. And I'm going to focus in on that affordability issue in a minute. Just to remind you that there's still this gap in connectivity. This is taken from the ITU in 2020. These are the different regions of the world with number of people connected per 100 population. So you have to look at this as numbers that are subtracted away from 100. So there's of course, it's as you would expect, higher income, higher connectivity. It's the case that there's greater mobile penetration, both cellular mobile and broadband mobile, than fixed. But in the end, it confirms that there's still a need to get more and more people. So what's been done to close the gap? I would identify two main policy strategies that I have seen in the US and developing countries, and I think really worldwide. And they divide into, first, to subsidize broadband deployment where that infrastructure does not exist. The other is to encourage broadband adoption where it's low. So subsidize deployment, encourage adoption. Now, more recently, the emphasis, I believe, in terms of the policymakers has been moving towards affordability and equity. In part, that's because the infrastructure has been widely deployed, not universally, but widely. And therefore, turning to other impediments to the universal service, such as affordability. There's a couple of ways of implementing strategies. Government intervention, of course, is one, and I'm going to talk about that mainly here. But there's where the government puts the bill to subsidize providers and consumers, and I think that's what Bhakti does. But also to make public investments, say Wi-Fi hotspots and municipal wireless networks. There's also market approaches, and promoting competition is one that's favored among economists. But also a favorite is just removing regulatory barriers, sharing infrastructure and access to space, rights of way, and so forth. The question I want to pose and hopefully answer in part in this policy area is, which policies work? What is it about the successful policy or policies? And I list here just, different ways of approaching those two strategies I had on the previous slide. One with being broadband deployment. You can do beauty contests of different projects, and that's very popular. Less popular, but having very good properties is the reverse auctions, where private companies will bid to procure the infrastructure that is requested by the government. So there are a handful of different broadband deployment policies. There's also affordable broadband programs, again, trying to get consumers incentivized to adopt. Discounts, vouchers, low-cost offerings, free public access. These are all different ways of working on the demand side. Effectively, I've divided this in supply side and demand side, as an economist will do. But they also can work together, or possibly. So we're going to see an example in a minute where provider subsidies to deploy broadband was contingent on offering an affordable consumer broadband plan. So working both sides of the market, both supply and demand. That can be quite effective to synergize both sides of the market. So this is the main point of this presentation, is that the world is really a policy laboratory for us. And right now there's experiments being conducted all over the world. And some of them were conducted before the pandemic. Many, many more have been introduced during the pandemic as a response. Some may even reach our ideal of a randomized controlled trial, or at least get close to it. The point is that they're generating a wealth of information and evidence that we can tap into and to use in our set of recommendations that are going to be put to the G20. There's much that we can learn from this. Of course, national markets are different. Regulatory institutions vary from one country to the next. And we have to take that into account. Which ones will transfer to a different setting? Countries differ in size, and therefore some policies may not scale very well if you move from a small country to a large country, or vice versa. You have to keep that in mind, but the idea is the same, that we've got a lot of evidence that is being generated. I thought this was worth pointing out that that the ITU had also identified, as of mid-19, 164 countries had broadband plans in place. These are just plans. They're not necessarily equivalent to Bhakti and a universal service program, but they had plans, some of which would be implemented. Most of these, as you can see in the pie chart in the right, are to connect to, are the first of the two strategies that I highlighted: build broadband infrastructure and connect households. A smaller amount is to promote adoption of broadband services side of the market. So this is, I thought I would just mention an illustration of what's going on in the US, since I know it the best. It may not travel very well for the reasons I just gave, but I think some of the lessons are the same regardless of the country. We have many legacy programs, especially run by the FCC, but also many other agencies. The pandemic has created an unprecedented number of programs funded by an unprecedented number of dollars. These have created opportunities and challenges. There's many programs, some of them running simultaneously, and it'll be more difficult as a result to tease out the effect of any individual program. Similarly, our 50 states and the District of Columbia often will run their own program in parallel, sometimes supplementing federal programs. And they start at different dates, and we'll see that in a second. Here are the main federal universal service programs. It's usually thought of as the FCC as being the source, but there's many others that are large agencies that are involved. This is just a quick snapshot of the FCC's universal service program. This is about $8.5 billion per year. It's divided into 4 buckets: high cost, low income, schools and libraries, and rural health care. Fairly typical buckets for a universal service program. And this has been running since for the last, well, it depends, but roughly 15 to 20 years. Much had changed with the pandemic, though. In this slide and the next, I just mentioned the 4 big laws that were passed that had impact on broadband. What you'll see is the number of programs and the dollar amounts just seem to grow over time as the laws are passed. I want to focus on the most recent one and the largest one, and that is the Infrastructure Act. It was passed in November 21, and it had a number of different programs, basically totaling up to about $65 billion over a 5-year period. And I want to look at these, the first 2 here, the Affordable Connectivity Fund and the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program. So the FCC's efforts at making broadband affordable goes back to about 2012 when it extended its Lifeline, or 2016 when it extended its Lifeline program to broadband access. It's not a large amount, $9.25 a month, but it garnered about 6.5 million participants. Part of that is due to some states, like the state that I'm in, California, supplementing it by more than doubling that amount. During the pandemic, the Emergency Broadband Benefits Program ran, at least for most of 2021. That bumped up the amount considerably to $50 per month. Included also money to underwrite connected devices. Much greater response of 9 million. But the infrastructure bill put in place the Affordable Connectivity Program, which began in January 1st of this year, cut back on the dollar amount, and still has become very popular with over 10 million as of last week. So the point of going through this is just to show that there's variations in these programs, certainly in terms of the monthly subsidy, and also in terms of some of the details that I didn't mention, like coverage of connected devices and eligibility requirements, that give us the opportunity to look back on the data and see which ones are most effective and most successful. Quickly, the NTIA's BEAD program, I shouldn't be quick here because this is the largest amount ever devoted to broadband, I think, in the world, certainly in the United States. $4.5 billion will be dispersed by the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Agency. But it will delegate to the states and their subgrantees by passing out the money to the states for last mile infrastructure for underserved areas. The idea here, though, is that this is going to generate a lot of experimentation, a lot of different variations, because each state is going to go its own way. And it's whether it's politics, culture, history, or some other historical fact that states are going to devise their own plans. From a standpoint of a policy analyst, this has its benefits. It has its benefits in that they explore different levers in which to close the digital divide. They're going to delegate to the states, but the states are then going to enlist their sub-grantees, which can be a private company, you know, an ISP, public organization like a school district, or local governments. They have to provide connectivity exceeding 100 meg down to 20 meg up, and they have to match 25% of whatever they get. And this is 25% can be, that 25% can be funding that they get from some other source, government source. And also they're gonna need to offer a low-cost plan. So this was my example where they're using both sides of the supply and demand market. They're offering them a subsidy to build infrastructure, but only if they induce consumers through a low-cost plan to adopt broadband. So a lot is going on. A lot of data is going to be coming in. We'll want to look at consumers' responses, the participation in the program, especially non-adopters. After all, the real success of a program like this is to get somebody who didn't have connectivity now to be connected, but also how costly that's going to be in terms of taxpayer dollars. And that providers' response is going to be as well, that will they participate in the program? And it's no surprise that participation can be quite low. Consumer participation in FCC's Lifeline program is less than 20% of eligible consumers. So part of that can be as a result of just poor communication to providers and consumers about the program. Again, what's the cost? What's the subsidy cost of that additional activity that providers have deployed? And then the idea of comparing different programs. And this could be across countries, could be across states here in the US, looking for all of those aspects that could make for a successful program. How sensitive is the success of the program to the size of the subsidy? We saw the subsidy go from $9.25 to $50 to $30 in the US, and that had a material effect on the participation and rate that we see. How is speed and latency benchmarks? How do they affect participation in these programs? And I already mentioned that outreach might be important, and easy onboarding of customers as well. So there's a great deal of evidence.
Professor Glenn, excuse me, you can use your last 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, I'm done. I just have a thank you slide left, and I just want to make the pitch that there's an enormous amount of very valuable information that hopefully somebody is gathering. And many of us would love to analyze it to try to design the better, if not the best, policies. Thank you.